Or to just think about folding your palms over your chest and uniting your heart together. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Dhammang Sanghang Namasami. My reverence to my original and fundamental teacher, the Buddha, the Blessed One, and also to all of the Dhamma teachings, truly limitless, vast as everything in this universe or many universes and beyond into the inconceivable, and also to all of the members of the Sangha throughout time and space, all of those who have awakened or are in the process of awakening, and all those who are growing their good roots of merit now, and who will be joining in the process of awakening over time, whoever and whatever they may be. And especially to our guardian devas here in this area, if there are any of them around. And my appreciation, because we've had very big storms here in this area during this last week. I understand have made it on national and international news. The local news is calling it Miracle March, because after years of drought, now this winter rainy season here in Northern California, this area we don't normally get much snow. This area gets winter rainstorms. So when I first moved here, I used to call it the autumn, winter, spring season, because the same time that the leaves start turning the color of Buddhist monastic robes, yellow and gold and orange and rust and brown, the same time that happens, then also then the winter storms start, and then also the same time then the first spring flowers start to come and the hills turn green. So there's the dry season, and then there's the autumn, winter, spring season. And so now the hills are emerald green here. The sky is gray and it's misty with a little bit of light mist on the leaves of the Bodhi tree that's over here by my left shoulder, with golden Dhamma wheel flags above it. And the whole valley, the Laguna del Santa Rosa, is flooded. I saw it yesterday. Unfortunately, it's a nature reserve, so it's a natural area to flood, and it's okay that it's flooded because it's not one of those crazy places where human beings have built all their houses in the flood zone, which does happen sometimes. So I'm glad there are some people who drove with their cars into deep water and then got into deep trouble because of it. But basically, I'm glad that at least here, right here, we've been safe, and there's still electricity to be able to speak with you right now. So we didn't know with the storms coming in whether that would happen or not, and it's our good fortune that there are our local friends. It wasn't storming too badly, and so I'm looking out at them now. And for those of you who are even from other countries, in Europe or Australia or Canada or wherever it may be, that you're able to join together too. So joining by heart, joining together in the Dhamma, this Dhamma for liberation, as the Blessed One, as the Buddha taught it. And now also, even visually, maybe we can see each other. Like I can see my Dharma sister Ani Wangmo smiling with the candlelight, offering of candlelight flickering behind her. So this is the third teaching or Dharma reflection in this Moral Awakening series. And because March is National Women's History Month here in the United States, and because yesterday was International Women's Day, I've been asked if I would specially say something about the history of women in Buddhism. And for one of the main leaders with CQ, Scholastic Institute Chogi Gyaltsen University, that's hosting this teaching, the Geshe requested that I say something about women's roles and responsibility in the Dhamma. So I made the title, Women and the Dhamma, Essential Roles, Rights, and Responsibilities. And in case any of us feel a cringe when we hear the word responsibilities, I hope it's not going to be too heavy for you or anything like that. I don't think so. Rather, what I'm going to be sharing are some of the things that I've found really, truly wonderful in early Buddhism that are inspiring and encouraging to me. And also with recognition of how Buddhism has evolved over time. And some of the other things that are maybe an evolution or a change to the early Buddhist teachings that are part of what we're inheriting in Buddhism now, that have developed over time. So I don't mean to completely blindside anything that might not be as inspiring or encouraging as something else. So in contemplating women's essential roles, rights, and responsibilities, I want to begin with roles, or women's essential role in Buddhism, according to the early Buddhist teachings. Now, I'll tell you a little more introduction. I've been curious in my life since I started to read about early Buddhism as a teenager in the works of the Pali Text Society, which were like Shakespearean English to me. So very hard for me to understand as a young American teenager. And yet I got the idea, even in the 19th and early 20th century, as the first translations into Elizabethan English were being made from the Pali texts. Mabel Wood of the Pali Text Society wrote an article that arose out of her surprise in what she was finding in the Buddhist teaching. And she entitled it, Women Leaders of the Buddhist Reformation. How amazing. It might have been dated 18 something, 19th century, maybe, early 20th century. But she was so surprised at what she found in the Pali texts and in the early Buddhist teaching as she was starting to read and to translate them. And for me too, I was quite inspired and interested in what I found, and then in learning about the manifestation of Buddhist traditions in the modern world. And I had a curiosity, if that's what the Buddha taught early on, then it seems in some ways that's what we have going on now, and in some ways it seems like there's been some evolution there. And I was curious what happened. What happened? I was curious to learn more about the Buddha's teaching, and then also to understand what happened. And that led me to work with World Bhikkhunī Sangha history as my thesis in graduate school. So not too many people picked that as their subject at that time. In fact, I don't know anyone else who did. And when I fill out these forms sometimes, like, what was your major of study? And then it gives you the choices. Then it's never on the drop-down list as one of the choices. And yet that's what I chose to study, as well as our Buddhist women's monastic discipline, comparative and text critical studies, which I still work with now, which means to look at how the teachings have been recorded, not only in one tradition, but in various traditions, and then to see, are they all the same, or is there some variety there? And if they stem from different times and places, to just notice the difference that's there in how the teachings were recorded, or how the monastic discipline was recorded in those different times and places. And there are things that can be learned from this that were interesting to me. And it helps to understand why things are as they are. And the study of history is a way of beginning to learn that without becoming an arahanta. When one becomes an arahant, when one completes the path and is fully awake, fully awakened, according to the early Buddhist teaching, one of the three knowledges or super knowledges is being able to see back in time, as I mentioned before, and then seeing back in time and understanding karmic causation or conditional causation for oneself individually, and then also basically for everything. That's part of the reconciliation process. So there's no more tension in the mind. Why is it like that? Or it shouldn't be like that. And the kind of stress and tension and frustration that we can hold in our hearts and hold in our bodies as well. And according to what those who've seen this have said, even sometimes from life to life, holding the things unresolved, even over lifetimes, with that kind of stress and tension that becomes like a binding cord, that holds the sense of identity to the ideas of what happened at a particular time that aren't clear and aren't resolved. Yes. So I found actually studying a little bit about these things to be helpful in these regards for me, even before becoming an arahanta. And sometimes even in my monastic community life, when one of my venerable sisters here does something, and it's like, oh, that's strange. Why did she do that? Why did she say that? And then when I understand, oh, right, that's why. Now I see. Now I understand. And there's a relaxing, and there's a releasing, and an unbinding, and then the situation is able to be free in my mind, not caught, not stuck. So this is actually a fundamental paradigm in the Buddha's teaching, in the basic, the basic operating principles. This works in so many ways. So I'd like to come now to the first part, essential roles, rights, and responsibilities, women in the Dhamma. And beginning with the essential roles. In the early Buddhist teaching, the essential role, the fundamental role that we see women in, or portrayed in the earliest of the records that we have is of the awakening woman. So the first essential role, that is the woman awakening, the awakening. Not to the exclusion of anyone else of any gender awakening. But this is the role in which we see the woman. That is the awakening woman. And there's a great love in the Buddhist traditions of storytelling the stories of awakening. And then how did it happen? How did she practice over time? When did she first encounter the Buddha's teaching? Under what circumstance? What a virtuous thing did she do that really watered her roots of virtue and enabled them to really go deep and be established in a way that was fundamental in her spiritual path and her awakening over time. There are so many stories like this. There's a genre in Pali called the Abhidhanas, which really answers the question for the Buddha himself and then for many women and men, disciples of the Buddha. What happened? Thinking back. And what we see then, the fundamental paradigm of her role in this genre and in the related Sanskrit genre that's basically the same word. It's called the Avadanas. And in the Avadanas, just like in the Abhidhanas, then this is the real focus, the feature. We see the awakening woman. And then the next thing that we see, or all of them, the next role that we see is of the woman Buddhist teacher and leader. In the Pali text, in the numerical discourses of the Buddha, in Pali called the Anguttara Nikaya. Numerical discourses of the Buddha. Fortunately, now we have a wonderful English translation by Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. Contemporary English, so much easier to understand than the old Pali Text Society translations from the 19th century that I was trying to read. I'm so happy to look at them. It's just beautiful to be able to read these teachings in contemporary English, with the translator being someone who is also completely dedicated to the path, not being a Buddhist scholar like a job, but really 100% completely dedicated and a strong practitioner as well as a strong scholar. And then the sense of that comes through live in the translations for those who are sensitive to these qualities and for whom they're important. This is wonderful. It's so great. It's like meeting a Dharma friend in the text. Meeting a Kalyana Mitta means a beautiful spiritual friend. So, excuse me, I hope that's not too hard on your ears. So, in the Book of the Ones, in the Pali text, numerical discourses of the Buddha, there is a chapter on the leading disciples of the Buddha, those who are teachers and exemplars, the greats among the exemplars, the Buddhist leaders. There are those who are commended and even, according to the Pali text, appointed by the Buddha as the leaders of the Buddhist Sangha. And many people know of Sariputta or Shariputra, Mahamoggalana as being two that the Buddha appointed as leaders of his Sangha. They're male bhikkhus, male monks. Many people know of them. Not quite as many people know that the Buddha appointed two highly exemplary women monastics also. Recommending to all those who would enter monastic life and anyone who is looking for an example and a female teacher to look to, Khema of great wisdom and Upalawana of great spiritual power as leaders and exemplars. So in the Anguttara Nikaya Book of Wands, then we find 13 of the foremost of the Buddha's women monastic disciples. And we find 10 of, additionally, 10 of the foremost of the Buddha's women non-monastic disciples. Yes? Now, you might think there are only women disciples mentioned there, but there are male monastics. There's a whole section for them too. And there are also laymen, upasaka, and sawakas. Actually, the very same number of laymen disciples as the laywomen disciples. And excuse me for saying laymen and laywomen, it's really not the right term for an upasika, sawika, or upasaka sawaka, because in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the Sutta of the Buddha's last days or final passing, he mentions very specifically in there his inheritance. As I mentioned in the last teaching, in teaching number 2, about being heirs of the Dharma, he mentioned his inheritance being passed on to the four assemblies or 4 categories of the Sangha. And in each category, there are those who have understood and seen deeply into the teaching, experienced it for themselves. So not only with theoretical or analytical knowledge, but also with the knowledge of their profound and real experience in the Dhamma, and then able to pass it on. Very important part of being one of the Buddha's heirs, then able to pass on, to transmit that teaching then to others legitimately. So all of those that we find in the texts, in Pali texts, in Sanskrit texts, in Chinese texts, and in the Tibetan texts, even in Uyghur, Kandari, Khotanese, these other languages now we understand as well. All of those who are so commended were praised, applauded by the Buddha himself for their role, their leadership in exactly this. So they're legitimately the Buddha's heirs. It's different than ancient Indian custom or even early American custom where property was passed in male lineage in many traditions. In the Buddhist tradition, then able to be passed through the women's lineage as well. And this is an essential part of the early Buddhist teaching. So in the Pali text, then we have 13 leading Bhikkhuni disciples in the Anguttara Nikaya Book of Wands. However, in the Chinese version of this text, in Sanskrit called the Ekotarika Agama. Agamas are basically another name for the Nikayas, the collections of the teachings, the 3 baskets. Agama means to pass down or the transmission. Nikaya just means a grouping or a collection. So it's basically the same thing. In the Chinese text, 2 of them, in the Ekotarika Agama, we don't have only 13 of these foremost leading eminent women monastic disciples of the Buddha. There are actually 50 of them listed. So a larger number, yes? And so we find different traditions actually pass down different numbers of these disciples, that the oral redactors may have memorized a certain number of them and passed them on. And I understand that people's memory used to be much better before they started using so many electronic devices. And that some were even able to memorize the entire 3 baskets of the Buddha's teaching with 84,000 sections. There are still some Burmese monks a number of them who have memorized the entirety. That's quite amazing. I don't know actually now of any other country in the world where there are the Buddhist monastics who are able to do that anymore. Maybe because Burma was a little more closed off for a while. We think military dictatorship not good, but preservation of the Dhamma good thing. So pluses and minuses there. So different traditions have passed this on differently. There is a Chinese text that's very popular and famous and really widely known in the Chinese or East Asian Buddhist traditions. China, Taiwan, Vietnam, Korea, Japan, and now spread throughout the world. So there's the tradition of the 10 great disciples of the Buddha. So if you were to do a Google search, like I did this morning for great disciples of the Buddha, I got Wikipedia mentioned 10, all male monks. Not a single bhikkhuni, not a single female monastic there on the list, not a single non-monastic male or female there on the list. 10 bhikkhus only, yeah? And so that's a part of what has been passed down. And even now, contemporary English Wikipedia, you could look and you could see this. Yes. Then I noticed also, by Googling, then there was another one, Disciples of Gautama Buddha. Also Wikipedia. I looked there, then sure enough, it showed Sariputta and Mahamoggallana on top, and then it had a long list of bhikkhus, mentioned only 3 bhikkhunis. But good news for all of you non-monastic disciples of the Buddha, because they had 5 lay women or non-monastic women and 5 non-monastic men disciples of the Buddha. So a full 10 there in the non-monastic category. But I feel sorry for the bhikkhunis. If I looked at that and I didn't know better, I would think, oh, there were just practically just a couple, smaller than a handful of the legitimate women monastic disciples of the Buddha. I don't know who wrote that Wikipedia page, but it's open source, so any one of you can go there and fix it up after listening to this talk, which is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And if you want the textual references to give in the footnotes, just let me know. I'll give them to you, okay? So you've heard me talking a lot about women disciples of the Buddha, and I just want to be clear that there are also the male and laymen disciples of the Buddha as well. And why I want to emphasize that is because in Buddhist traditions since 2,600 years ago, there's been a tendency in some traditions in terms of roles to have the monastic role be the male role primarily, and the supporter role be the woman's role primarily. And so I just want to make very clear in these early Buddhist teachings that there are male disciples of the Buddha who are listed and asked in the text by the Buddha to be remembered as supporters. And the number of male supporters, those who are remembered for their outstanding generosity, their outstanding consideration for the things that would be helpful, their great kindness, these kinds of things. There are the good number of the laymen or non-monastic male disciples of the Buddha in that category as well. We actually, in these texts, we don't see an unbalance there. We don't see that weighted more heavily on the male or the female side. And in terms of those who excelled in meditation or who excelled in Dhamma teaching, or who excelled in understanding. We don't see that weighted more heavily on the male or the female side either. So I wish that you would understand and remember that. That's what we find in the early Buddhist teachings. And as I already said, according to where you look, you'll see other things. You might see monks alone, or you might see, it just depends on where you look. But if you look in these texts that I've mentioned, this is what you may see. So I want to emphasize that absence of polarity in the early Buddhist teachings between the male monastic and the female supporter. The woman's role is not only lauded as being the giver or being the supporter in any way. In fact, in the Pali Buddhist texts, there's a whole section, now it's a whole book, the Iti Uttaka, which are, I think I mentioned it before, last week. They're teachings that the Buddha gave to a non-monastic woman who was brilliant in the Dhamma. And she had access to a large number of women who weren't able to come and listen to the Buddha's teaching directly. So he taught her and asked her to teach them. And she did successfully and effectively. At one point, when the Buddha was asked about his disciples, he answered in a way that seems almost proud, but I think not with a sense of deluded pride, but just in vouching for the efficacy of his teaching and the completeness of his teaching. He mentions those women who have realized noble and saintly attainments in the path in very large number as one of what he felt were the points of non-deficiency in the Buddhasasana, in his teaching as he was setting it forth, and its efficacy or its effectiveness. So later on, then, when the texts were being compiled for memorization and passing them down, then after the Buddha had passed away, the bhikkhus, the male monks, went to her to get those teachings, to be able to include them in the canon, in the Tipitaka. So here you see role of one of the eminent, outstanding, non-monastic women disciples of the Buddha. She is acting as a great support, exemplar. Or robes or other requisites. So if you'd like to learn more about this, I would highly recommend, I mentioned already the Numerical Discourses of the Buddha, the Book of Ones. Look for chapter 14 there if you'd like to read about this yourself from the early Buddhist teaching. And I would recommend Venerable Bhikkhu Analayo's Outstanding Bhikkhunis in the Ekotarika Agama. This is translated from the Chinese texts. It's been published in Women in Early Indian Buddhism. And also, eminent Buddhist scholar Peter Skilling has an article, Esa Agra, from the Journal of the International Association of Buddhist Studies. And these are translations from the Mula Sarvastivada tradition, which is the tradition that's the living Vinaya and textual tradition passed down in Tibetan Buddhism. So he did wonderful translations from there in his article Esa Agra, that is, these are the foremost, these are the leaders. And this is about female roles in early Buddhism. Nuns, laywomen, donors, and goddesses are mentioned as well. So if you'd like to do further studies on this subject, I would recommend those three sources to look as a start, and rather than your quick Google search, which will yield up what I already mentioned. So you can go a little deeper and see the texts themselves. So the second point that I wanted to speak about was women's rights in Buddhism. Now, there are those traditional teachers who say that Buddhism has no concept of human rights or women's rights. And that's a very good and interesting point, because we don't know of any specific word in Pali or in Sanskrit or even in classical Buddhist Chinese or Tibetan that could directly translate into human rights or women's rights. So there's the question, do they exist in Buddhism? And I'd like to look into this for a moment. I mentioned my studies of Vinaya, the monastic discipline. If we look in the monastic discipline, we find lots of precepts. Originally, these precepts were the form, the guides and the form of Buddhist monastic life. In the very early days, these precepts were just the fundamental principles of non-harming, of goodwill. There were so many fully awakened ones that the precepts arose naturally in every moment of their behavior out of their awakened heart. As the monastic community grew, then there were those who came into the community who weren't able to wake up just immediately on hearing the Buddha teach, or even within 7 days. The slow ones. Some of them, it even took them years. In the meantime, in those years, sometimes they had what we call foibles and follies. Some messing around. Sometimes they got into trouble. Various things happened that gave rise to the precepts coming into being. One of the things that we find happening is not enlightened male monks doing things that seemed like they were taking advantage of the females. Yes? And thus we have a whole category of precepts for the bhikkhus that are meant to prevent them from committing human rights violations. No. Infringing on women's rights in Buddhism. No. That control their behavior with regards not primarily honoring the woman's role as a woman awakening or as a woman practitioner or as a woman teacher, but looking at a woman through a much more worldly lens. Yes? And looking through that worldly lens, then maybe they ask them to give them food, or they ask them to wash their robes for them, or they ask them to clean things for them, or they ask them to do kinds of things that they were used to, services of women doing for men in the lay life at that time. And yet, when this happened, the Buddha didn't just say, yes, that's right, guys, good on you. And make precepts that said, yes, a bhikkhuni should give her food to a bhikkhu. Yes, a bhikkhuni should wash the bhikkhu's robes. Yes, the bhikkhuni should clean up after the bhikkhu. In fact, the most noble thing that the bhikkhuni can do is to spend her entire time serving the monks' community as much as she can. That's actually not what we see in the early Buddhist teaching. Although some of those bhikkhunis blessed their good hearts when they were asked to do something with their beautiful heart of generosity and kindness, they just offered that. But then we have a precept coming up. And the precept is not only for the bhikkhunis to tell them not to do that, but for the bhikkhus. The bhikkhus, that's the male monastics, to restrain their behavior. So we have quite a few precepts like that the bhikkhus have and the bhikkhunis don't. Yes? So someone could ask, does that mean that it's okay for bhikkhunis to order bhikkhus around? Shall the nuns, shall the female monastics, is it okay for them to forget about the monks being practitioners and just think your main job is to be supporting me all the time, supporting me in the path. And actually, there are a lot of precepts that are there that put requirements upon the men's monastic community to act in a supportive role towards the women's monastic community. So there are precepts in that side also that get into responsibility, but not responsibility necessarily for women in Buddhism, but responsibility for men in Buddhism. I know in my monastic life, sometimes I feel like just withdrawing from it all, don't want to deal with anyone, don't want to see anyone, and I am happy, or I'm happy just to be with my female monastic companions, and completely happy if I don't see any men or any male monks on a given day, then it's okay with me. And yet I appreciate that there are the precepts that make it so even though I might like to separate off, or some of the male monks might wish to separate off at some time. If we look at the precepts themselves, they actually give a model of coexistent harmony and thinking about supporting one another. But there are parameters on that support. So for the bhikkhus also, in Vinaya and the monastic discipline, there's a grouping of precepts that the bhikkhunis actually don't have, which are a protection for honorable and respected lay women, not the female monastics. I started by speaking about the female monastics, and that's what I've studied about most. But in our monastic discipline, there are protections built in, precepts that the bhikkhus, the male monks, have that also are protection and give rights to the women's monastic community. So if a well-respected upasika disciple has some issue with a male monk's behavior, he's done something that seems doubtful or dubious or inappropriate, the monastic discipline mandates that the monastic community should hear and acknowledge and work with her complaint. So would this be called a right or not? A human right, a woman's right? I'm not sure, but there are these things built in the precepts that give highest priority towards looking upon one another as awakening beings, or beings with the ability to awaken, or those who are in the path of practice, or those who are teachers and leaders, independent of what category they may be in. And we talk about animal rights these days as well, and again, not phrased animal rights as such in the Buddhist teaching, and yet like right to life for the animals could be considered implied with precepts that say not to kill not only human beings, but also our fellow living creatures, including the animals. So I'll say it's just an open question as to whether these would be called rights or not. But there are the teachings that are built in the Vinaya, in the monastic discipline, in the precepts, as well as in the Dhamma teachings, that could, by inference, be considered to point to human rights, or rights to life, or women's rights, or even animals' rights in contemporary language, in contemporary parlance. We say here, when a woman is fully ordained as a bhikkhuni, that she has full rights and full responsibilities in the Sangha. As a member of the dual Sangha, means as a member of the monastic, male and female monastic Sangha, as well as a member of the greater Sangha, that she comes into full rights and responsibilities. So then this is the third part. We come to the third part that I hope to speak with you about, which is about responsibility, and was especially requested by the Geshe to speak about. So I already began to speak about responsibility as heirs of the Dhamma, even last week. Yeah. And I've already begun to speak about it now. And really, the roles, the rights, and the responsibilities are so intertwined in this teaching. They're so integrated with one another that to separate them out piece by piece is doing something artificial in a way. But just to highlight the aspect of responsibility. So as I mentioned earlier, those who are the heirs of the Dhamma, heirs of the teaching, the women monastics included, non-monastic women included, those by definition in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta of the Digha Nikaya, the long discourses of the Buddha, those who have understanding and experience in this teaching, then and are able to pass it on, able to share with others. The responsibility for that sharing is theirs. Yes? So the Buddha's own compassion on awakening and seeing that other living beings also have potential to grow in this path and awaken as well, and then acting on that compassion, and then the Sangha that arose out of that, that compassion as one of the, let's say, like underlying prime directives, not only to receive new monastics, but to share the Dhamma with all those who came, all those who were encountered, even to go traveling around the world, even at that time walking barefoot. The Buddha is supposed to have walked and walked and walked and walked here and there. And now my Dhamma name is Tathālokā. Tathālokā. Aloka, one of the meanings of aloka in the Buddha's teaching, talk about the Buddha's aloka. He's supposed to have in meditation then used his aloka, his eye, or like light of the mind, to be able to kind of scan around like the beam of a lighthouse or something, just looking for who is ripe, who is ready to be able to benefit from this teaching. And then later on, when getting up and taking his robe and taking his bowl, he would go in their direction to meet them out. And oh boy, a big surprise and a big change in their life. Yeah? What a wonderful thing. How amazing. And for us too, when we go out and around, not only to stay cloistered, not only to stay secluded, if we follow the traditional precepts, we actually must have contact with someone who is not fully ordained to be able to eat, even on any given day. This arises out of the Buddha's compassion, yes? Knowing that otherwise the one who is happy and content may like to just go off to the mountain and, just happily abide in bliss in their meditation and then disappear. Maybe they leave only a rainbow, maybe they leave nothing at all. Perhaps you find their bones later. But they may like to do these kinds of things, yes? But if they are come into contact with traditional monastic precepts, then these have the compassion for the rest of the world built into them. So we must have that connection, and we're not supposed to go away in seclusion without having that connection somehow, some way, with another fellow living being. not for a long, not to do that for a long, long period of time, but to keep that connection so that the benefit can flow both ways. Yes. So there is some Pali that is called like mutual supportiveness, mutual rehabilitation. It appears in our recitation, our women's monastic discipline in the Patimokkha. I really love this phrase there in the Patimokkha. When I hear it now, like yesterday was the new moon. The full moon and new moon are days for our Uposatha observance in monastic life. And if there's a Sangha gathered together, then there's the recitation of the Patimokkha. I don't know how many times I've listened to it now. I'm so glad now we have a Sangha here that I'm able to listen with regularly, more regularly. I love that part. So, responsibility. Returning to responsibility. We talked about teachers, the responsibility to teach. We talked about leaders, the responsibility to lead. However, it's not considered that everyone is going to have the merit for leadership. However, with regards to gender, women in Buddhism, the women and female monastics and the non-monastic women do legitimately have the place and the roles as leaders. And when we look at the early Sangha paradigm of the early Sangha, then we see parity there. So both male and female leaders, practitioners, and I already mentioned supporters. In South and Southeast Asia, both the monastic community and the lay community or community of non-monastics consider that they have important, essential roles in different everyone has a role as a supporter in one way or another, whether offering grace or whether arranging for it to be shared in book form or via the internet, like this, or in whatever way. Then someone who's on may have their mic not turned off or something. So,
Shirley, could you please just turn your unmute yourself, mute yourself? I could not do it. Thank you.
Yeah. So, speaking of supporters, I'd like to speak about one teaching that touches on support and touches on women in the Dhamma. You may feel like you've already heard this point from me and other things that I've said, but here it is. There's one sutta. Imagine the middle of the course. Number 2. It's called the Dakina Vikanga Sutta, or the Greater Exposition on Offerings. And I find this sutta so interesting. So, this sutta, then the Buddha's own foster mother wishes to offer him a robe. She's woven it herself. So hand-loomed by a queen of all people and his own foster mother. Yeah. And so she wishes to offer this robe to him as the greatest of all individuals, the greatest of all beings in the world at that time, one of, most wonderful and highest merit. It sounds perfect and beautiful, doesn't it? And then the Buddha always emerging with these things, says no. He says no. He says, he asks her to give it to the Sangha, and says then there's this exposition on offerings that follows in the Pali text, in the middle-length discourses of the Buddha. Then the Buddha says that to give to the Sangha is greater than to give to any individual in the entire world, no matter who it is, even if that's the Samma Sambuddha. To give to the Sangha is of greater worth, of greater value, greater merit. And then he gives a list of types of Sangha. The very top one on the list, the one that he says that is of greatest and supreme merit, is where there is the Bhikkhu and the Bhikkhunī Sangha. Yeah. So the Bhikkhu and the Bhikkhunī Sangha, so the men's and women's and men's Sangha are being offered to and supported. That's put at the very, very top of the list. Below that is the Sangha of only one gender, whether that's just the men's community or just the women's monastic community. They're placed lower than that. This is very telling to me and seems really important for the Buddha's paradigm of his inheritance that he was passing down and what he wished to support. So if someone is given a gift and then they dedicate that to something else that they wish to support, that's their dedication. So here we have a look at the Buddha's own dedication to the Sangha and his investment back in it, and what kind of Sangha. It's very clear that it's one in which women have their full role and full rights and responsibilities. That's the implication that emerges in this teaching. Even, in fact, if it were a Sangha, though, going down the list, even if it were a Sangha of just 4 novices, we find in the comparative studies, even a Sangha of 4 novices, if they're rightly practicing Sila, Samadhi, and Panya, if they're developing their ethics, their moral virtue, practicing with the precepts, developing their meditation, working with cultivating insight, growing wisdom, if they're practicing with those things, 3 things rightly, even if they're just unattained novices, making that offering to the 4 of them, that is to a Sangha of them, still the Buddha says greater than offering to any individual in the world. This is investing into the community, back into the community as a great merit and part of, we would say, the Buddha's dedication. And if we take up the Buddha's dedication and dedicate ourselves to that as well, then we could say that becomes is it right to call it a responsibility for us? A self-undertaken responsibility? Now, if you inherited $8 million, or $10 million, or $50 million, what do you think? Are you going to be able to inherit that money without having any responsibility for it? Or is there going to be some responsibility that comes with it? Yeah, it's a lot of money. I actually know one of my old friends won the California lottery. And I got to see for a friend winning, she won $80 million. So for winning $80 million, I knew her for years and years. She and her husband had a mom and pop shop down in the San Francisco Bay. Their kids went to public school and, they had their grandparents, and it seemed like an ordinary family going along in their mom and pop shop. They sold lottery tickets in there. Then every day at the end of the day, for the tickets that were left over, then one of them would scratch. And then one day they got the winning ticket. They won $80 million. Oh boy. In terms of responsibilities, wow, yeah, it's kind of awesome. It's amazing. It can be, the unfolding of something magnificent and fantastic, or it can be your road and doorway to hell for that kind of thing. For the Dhamma, for those who are intent upon awakening, uh, then this goes in a good way. As in the Vinaya text, it's like the hand kind of image of hand in hand, or mutual supportiveness. And with the rights, with all the benefits, then also comes the responsibilities together that are rooted in compassion for others as for ourselves. Yes. So, I had thought to speak with you about this ethic also of non-harming with regards to these things. There is a woman named Alison Goodwin. She wrote an article that was published in the Journal of Buddhist Ethics in April of 2012. And working with the Buddha's teachings on morality, even moral awakening. In fact, the very teaching that we looked at last week, last time, don't know if you saw this, if you were together last week, we talked about the Buddha's teaching to his son Rahula at Mango Stone, Majjhima Nikaya number 61. And in that we find fundamental teachings on non-harming related to the three karmas of body, speech, and mind. Alison Goodwin is a scholar, researcher, and scientist. And in her research, she looked at hundreds of psychological and social studies that show negative expectations and negative concepts of self and others, as well as discrimination based on the idea that any particular group is inferior to another, adversely affects those who discriminate, so, as well as those who are subject to the discrimination. In her article, Right View, Red Breast and White Bones, that I mentioned, published in the Journal of Buddhist Ethics in April 2012, she argues that both genders are harmed by negative teachings, even negative teachings in Buddhism about women, and by practices that are discriminatory and limit the authority, rights, activities, or status of anyone based upon their gender. So this is very interesting. She's looking at all of these scientific, psychological, and social studies. She argues this based on the Buddha's instructions and teachings in the texts, which recommend evaluating teachings to see if there are any views or practices within those teachings that are of the type that is proven or known to lead to harm. She argues that as Buddhists, with these fundamental moral and ethical principles as foundation of the path, that if we know of anything, any practices, or any element of any teachings to be so harmful, that we can conclude, as the Buddha said in the teaching itself, that such a teaching is actually not Buddha Dharma, actually not true Dharma, or if it came from anywhere else, that it should also be understood that it's not true Dharma, of the liberating kind that we spoke on extensively last time. And if one recognizes such views or such practices for oneself as a practitioner, those views or practices should be abandoned. Pahana in Pali means to release, to let go, to abandon, to distance oneself from that. So I found this very, very interesting because in that mango stone Rahula Ovada Sutta, the Buddha also boils down all karma, all actions of body, speech, or mind into the categories. We're asked to analyze, do they lead to harm or no harm for self or others, and states that this is an essential practice of all of those who have ever awakened, who are awakening now, or who will awaken and become liberated in the future, no matter who they are. He says all samanas and brahmanas, which means including even those who are not Buddhist. So this is just a fundamental principle, fundamental Dharma principle that transcends even Buddhism itself. But the Buddha is strongly and clearly teaching and recommending to his own beloved son, flesh of his flesh, blood of his blood, yes, in passing on his Dharma inheritance. He gave this teaching clearly to him and asked him to reflect and to contemplate on it over and over again, before, during, and after every action of body, of speech, and of mind on this fundamental principle. So, between principles and Buddhist culture, the things that are happening in Buddhist culture, there are many people who are born Buddhist. And there are those who come to Buddhist temples for the food fair, like the Thai Buddhist temple that's not far from here. Lots of people like to go on the weekend and Thai food fair, a lot of good food, and also like arts and culture. There's classical dance and music and beautiful Buddhist artwork and things like this, and all of those things are wonderful, but not to be exempted from this fundamental teaching. Yes, and if any kind of culture that is named Buddhist culture were to go contrary to these fundamental teachings or fundamental principles of the Buddha, then that would be called, I think the Buddha mentioned this as something like, what is it, like, sometimes the people compared the Buddha to a lion. And even now, here, even in Northern California, there are some places where people, like, they went on safari and they have the stuffed lion skin hanging on their mantle above the fireplace or something like this. Then lion head is there, and apparently even in the Buddhist time, where the people who hunted and killed the lions, and then the lion skin could be stuffed with something else. Also, even the lion, considered to be the greatest of animals, was not free from parasites. And if the lion ate something that had worms in it, then those worms could get in. The worms would then infest the lion, even the greatest of beings, and eat it up from the inside. The Buddha is here making a comparison between himself and his teaching, and him being compared to the lion, and what can happen. So he mentioned that there are the occasions where this kind of thing happens, and then, the skin on the outside still looks like the lion, but inside it's being eaten up alive. And now I don't mean to say anything discriminatory against worms or parasites. I really actually love worms myself. I really like them, and butterflies too, and many kinds of insects, and so nothing discriminatory against them per se. It's just an analogy related to how things can happen sometimes. That if we think about being heirs of the Dhamma and we understand what we're practicing now and what we're doing now is actually creating Buddhism and present by our choices of our actions. And it's also creating what will be Buddhism in the future. And that this is something that we can bring mindful choicefulness to and intentionality to. And that the Buddha himself is asking us to bring a reflection, fundamental principles to whatever we are doing. So then we see a directive here for taking care, not only for ourselves, but taking care in such a way, as we talked about last in the Rahula Vada Sutta, thinking about this for oneself and for others over and over again. Will it cause any harm for myself or for others? Did it cause any harm? Has it caused any harm? Is it or will it? To think in that kind of way. Yeah. So if we don't see, if we don't know, in a way our moral responsibility is less, right? Because we're blind, we're ignorant. This is where the moral awakening part comes in this subject also. Yes, because when we see, when we know, when we understand, there is moral with that understanding, with that seeing, that knowing, that type or that level of awakening, and there's a moral type of imperative that comes together with that. But it's not really someone else telling us to do something. If it's a genuine awakening in ourselves, then we feel, we know it, it's part of what's natural in having that experience. In not only having theoretical knowledge and book learning, but really seeing and knowing for ourselves, as we talked about Hidayotapa and teaching number 1, it arises truly, it arises naturally out of our own conscience, the natural, true, pure sense of moral and ethical integrity that's part of us being a human, and our nature, when ignorance is not occluding, covering over our vision. So people debate whether Buddhism is a religion or not in the contemporary United States. Some people say it's not, that it's a practice, that it's a philosophy, that it's a way of life. I wouldn't disagree with any of that. It is all of those things. Religion, literally, I learned from Latin, religare, to reconnect, to reunite, to bind. For us in the Buddha's teaching, this doesn't mean union with God in the same way that many people or some people conceive of it in other religious teachings, but rather to reconnect with our fundamental awakened potential. It's looking at the role part again. What is our role in this teaching? So to reconnect with our fundamental awakening potential, and not only potential, but then to really experience what the nature of the mind and the heart is when it's awake and aware, and not being overrun by defilements, which are temporary, transitory, not essential to the nature of the mind, not in the Buddha's teaching. Again, in the Book of Ones, numerical discourses of the Buddha in the Book of Ones, some of you may have heard this before, but there's a sutta in there called the Pabasara Sutta. Paba is light, Prabha, Sara is essence or the nature. And the Buddha says in his teaching, in this sutta, in the Book of Ones, that this mind is bright. This mind or this heart, its essential nature is fundamentally bright, fundamentally light, sometimes called clear light, Abba, sometimes called clear light. Like clear light awareness, I've heard from some of my Tibetan friends. Yes. So if it is occluded by transitory defilements, then it's so. In the absence of those defilements, it is fundamentally bright. So this is very different than some other teachings which would lead us to believe that the fundamental nature or essence of humanity is sinful. Different than that. Different, basically different than that. Defilements may come and go. Yes, and the things that we do, the things that we've been talking about, what we practice, what we work with, is effective with regards whether those defilements come and go or not. It makes a big, big difference in this regard for whoever one is. Yeah. So this nature of awareness for us, for all of us who are here together, and even for all of humanity. And then can we extend out to all living beings, all those with awareness, with sentience, that is with the ability to see and know, that extends then the Buddha's teaching beyond just divisions of race, class, caste, gender, age, ethnicity, through all of humanity, but even beyond humanity, to all the other species that also have awareness. Yes? But for human beings, there's a particular level. We can develop a particular level of awareness where we're able to really, and this is what the Buddha's teaching is fundamentally about, where we're able to take out the root of those defilements and really, do the practices that clear our minds, and then live free of the distortion of mind, these distortions of mind and defilements. So this is the wonderful thing that's been passed down to us. So in that list that I just said, race, class, caste, ethnicity, age, I did include gender in there. It's my understanding that it's supposed to be there. That it's an essential part of getting beyond these kinds of discriminations that can be so disempowering. This would be a wrong teaching on karma, to use teachings on karma related to any of these categories of human beings, to then put them down and disempower them, rather than to, as many of the suttas say, like what was turned down, to turn it upright again. Yeah, and so this is very beautiful, beautiful ending in many of the Buddha's teachings, where the person experiences in themselves, in encountering this teaching, encountering the Buddha, their sense, as they described it, is something that had been turned upside down and being turned upright again, and then feeling and knowing that uprightness in themselves with this teaching, with the Dhamma, the Buddha, the Dhamma, and Sangha as being the supporter, the support, the enabler for that very uprightness. So supporting their inspiration, their upliftment, and then their freedom, their liberation. Yes. So not in any of those categories properly in the Buddha's teaching is anyone to be damned or to be exempted from this freedom and liberation. So this is our heritage, and if Buddhism were to be called a religion for whatever reason, rather than the meaning of religion as a tie that binds, properly in the Buddhist teaching, it should be considered a means to unbind, to release, for freedom and for liberation. So for those who encountered my teaching for International Women's Day yesterday, they might note some repetition. I'm practically quoting some of the things from my International Women's Day teaching yesterday. But I feel these things are worth saying again. In the suttas, obviously the Buddha said them over and over again. And now we think it is one of the most meritorious things to print hundreds and thousands and even millions of copies of these teachings and spread them around the world as much as possible, to give voice to them, to chant them over and over again, to reflect and to reflect on, to remember them, to share them with others. So I think it's worthy saying twice in 2 days, and worthy saying once for those for whom it's the first time. So I would like to stop here with women in the Dharma, roles, rights, and responsibilities, and to give all of you, those who are here together with me, and those of you who are on from farther away via the internet, to give you a chance to share your thoughts or questions. Those who are here are just smiling and looking peaceful and nice. I have to put on my glasses to see those who are farther away. Does anyone have any thought or question that you would like to share or to ask? Did you get anything new that was surprising to you?
I had a question about what you were talking about, the precepts for bhikkhus being serving as protection for the bhikkhunis. I was wondering, in your own experience, if you have felt like the differences in precepts between men and women monastics has protected you, or if you felt it's sort of constrained you or your practice, or a combination of both, or like how has it actually played out for you in your development?
Traditions. So I mentioned comparative studies, and so there are precepts that other traditions have that have been spread around far and wide that some people might assume that this tradition has as well, that it might not. So I just mentioned about that. But in terms of protection and constraint, for discipline itself, I used to hike, and I used hiking boots for strong hiking, like the kind of hard boots that you lace up really kind of tight and strong, and they're hard on the bottom, and they're a constraint. They're a restriction. You're not able to move your feet really freely, comfortably, and easily in them. And when I hiked to carry the important supplies that I needed with me, then also I would strap on this heavy pack. In fact, as heavy as I could carry many times. I would train to be able to carry a heavier pack, just to be able to carry those things that I felt like would be needed for going out for a hike, and strap it on. And then, I would feel the restriction of those boots and of those straps with the pack, and they're tight and binding. And also I knew the benefit and the support of those laces, of those straps. So there are many things in our monastic discipline that I feel similar to that. Yes, they are restricting, and there are the supportive aspects. And those two things, if one is hiking and one understands about that clearly, then you don't feel bad about it because you understand the benefit of it. And you also know, well, I would get so used to the boots and then the carrying the pack and that kind of thing that when I take the boots off and put down the pack, it's like, you feel like you're floating. It's so amazing. You didn't even feel the weight of it anymore after a while. It becomes like second nature. You get used to working with it. And the boots, they start to break in and you feel comfortable with them and you learn how to adjust your pack well and that kind of thing. And then although it's tight and binding, it doesn't feel so difficult as when you're unfamiliar with it. There's the way that I really feel this discipline like that. There's the way I feel this human life like that, in fact, even all the more so. I tell you truly, I feel like it is, excuse me for saying, but it's such a burden to have to eat every day. And there's this endless bathing and day after day after day. It's not only the eating but the brushing of the teeth, and then how many times flushing the toilet over and over and over again, and all of that. I mean, what is it we say, number one and number two is just like endless, just flowing and flowing out of this body, and just so much effort and energy and all of that. And if we don't have a sense of meaning or a sense of purpose for it, then what? So many living beings have to suffer and have to die over it. And there are just so many things. And I have this sense of, as many people experience with meditation at some point when they're not engaged with their five khandhas, or with even just not with the bodily khandha anymore. Sometimes they experience this sense of that lightness and that freedom, yes. Or if someone is practicing meditation and they enter into the second jhana, where there's no more thinking, then they experience what the freedom is, the openness and spaciousness and lightness of, just the, all of that stuff that we think about, and the mind is going into fabricated and compounded things over and over again, proliferating and proliferating. They experience the stopping of that, and they experience that freedom. And so when one also gains real depth in the practice, if a person becomes a stream enterer, they open their Dhamma eye, and also they experience a whole other level of freedom, because the fears, the doubts, especially doubt, is so heavy. And our minds being, bound up in false beliefs and kind of, dogmatic or ritualistic thinking, or, all of these things that are just taking so much of our mental bandwidth, even when we don't recognize it. When one experiences those things coming to a stop, and what the mind is like, free of those things, so wonderful. So fantastic. Like with the hiking, you hike, and you sweat, and you get dusty, and you get blisters and these kinds of things, and then you come up to the view spot, and it's fresh, and it's clear, and you can see out over the distance, over the mountains, like 1,000,000 miles, it feels like, to the end of the earth. And then the night sky, you look out, and it's just open and vast and expansive and endlessly deep, right? That would be a very small, paltry, mundane comparison to what that sense of mind is. So why I'm making this analogy is because there are things in the discipline that I compare to the hiking boots and the pack and that kind of thing. And then for the hiker, there are the benefits that come. If she is a real Dharma hiker, then those benefits come in each right step. not only the viewpoints are right, not only the spot where you just stop and enjoying the view, but in each right step, her benefits come. If she's a real Dharma hiker, right? For working with this Dhamma and discipline too, if one engages one's mind with these things well, then each bit, each practice, each work with it is also, it has its benefits unto itself, or the benefits unto themselves of doing that practice. If our minds are clear, we see and know that. If our minds are blinded, like the one who maybe hasn't been on a hike before, first time I went out as the young kid with my parents hiking. It's like I have my little pack on, I have my little boots on, I'm holding my mom's hands or my dad's hands. And, are we there yet? How much longer do we have to go? Come on, honey, one more step. Let's just get around this turn, and then you're going to be able to see something beautiful. The parents would say these kinds of things, yeah? And I didn't know as a young girl because of my lack of experience. Now I know about these things, so I understand, yeah? I trust about how these things work. And for who works with this path also, when they understand how it works, then a kind of trust grows in them because they know. When we don't know yet, then hopefully we have Dhamma friends and teachers who will take us by the hand in a way. Even these texts themselves, the teachings themselves, that we hold on to them, and then we hope that they're true when they say, just one more step, just one more step. Come on, when you turn around the corner, it's going to, there's the good stuff here in this. Then if we trust and we do that, we'll come to it. Yeah, if we don't, and we don't work with the things that are important and effective to work with, then that effect is not able to come. And that just comes back to our own action, our own karma. Really, do we do the effective things ourselves for our bodily actions, our behaviors, for our speech, for our words, and for our mind? Really key for our mind. Even for our speech, I talk to people about how they talk to themselves silently. It's no harm. No one can hear, right? Except for oneself, and what it does to oneself that then has the harm to others as well. So that talking that you do to yourself, even, what voices are you playing over and over again? Are they supportive, helpful ones, or are they something else? What do you have running in there? For how we use the mind, and then to stop running it with so many things, to take the time to allow it to, clear and become stable and clear, and to do the work that enables getting into those sublime, peaceful states that heal our mind, and even the things that then free the mind from something. Sometimes we don't know that it's happened at the time. Even in the Buddha's lifetime, in the text, it says there are those who became arahants, completely awakened ones, and they didn't know because they had been going along so well. They're not the ones who are suffering so much in their practice. Some people suffer more in their practice than others. There's the dukkha patipada and the sukha patipada. The sukha patipada means the practice that's like, some people, their way of practice is so joyful and so happy, and for others it necessarily involves a lot of suffering, a lot of trying hard and hard work, and have to go through so much difficult stuff and things like that. It's real, genuine, valuable practice that's there, yeah. But when the result of that comes, then we know for sure about that. Then the deep trust and the underlying fear that was there, even we didn't know what was going on, when it's absent. And the mind, it's just the mind, the heart is there, in the absence of that doubt, in the absence of that fear, in the absence of so many delusions and false ideas. awesome, awesome, really great and excellent. But it's the working, the step by step on the ground working, and the things that not only in Vinaya, not only in our monastic discipline, but whoever we are, if we have unhealthy habits of mind, just feeding them and letting them go on and doing that, not restraining them, it's not necessarily going to help whoever we are. So the precepts, there are a lot of things in there that are meant, like patimokkha. Pati is like to turn around. Moksha is liberation. So I think about it like kind of like an electronic fence, as we used to have where I lived in northeastern Washington State. There's electronic fence, and if the horse comes to the electronic fence, they get a little shock and they move away from it. For patimokkha also, for the precepts, if we come to something and touch on it, because the precept is there, then it alerts us we're coming to something. And the main meaning and principle is to say, oh, you're coming up on the parameter here. Turn back, back to center, back to looking towards liberation, back towards the Dhamma again. Yeah. So about 60% of our precepts are shared between the men's and women's monastic communities. Those precepts that I talked about that restrain the bhikkhus in regards to their behavior towards the bhikkhunis, not to exploit, not to take advantage, we don't have those precepts. The precepts that I talked about the bhikkhus having, that mandate, acknowledgement, and care for the honorable non-monastic woman, upasika, laywoman, coming to mention some difficulties, some trouble with a monk who is not behaving well. We don't have those either. We don't even have that category of precepts. Still, I feel we can learn something from them. Still good for us too. And we have others that the bhikkhus don't have. Some related to the difference in anatomy, and some, I think, are related to difference in culture and society in times both past and present. So I think you may have been asking about this last category, but I want to talk to you about Dhamma. It's like the fundamental principles of Dhamma that are important for our liberation. Yeah. And how we can see the relationship between things that pinch and bind, and then also how they can be seen and known as supports for liberation. To use them like that anyway. Yeah, if we have a choice in terms of how we use something, what better way to use it? Is there any better way to use it? That's my thought anyhow. So we have maybe just a couple of minutes left. Is anyone here? Anything that she would like to ask? Or to say?
Would you speak to that last question? The one part, just perhaps that you personally in your pathway have had support from bhikkhus, and those kinds of interactions and having guidance or whatever as well along the way, and as a part of your path, that has been a positive influence.
Yes, I have had support and guidance from bhikkhus, from elder male monastic teachers, and also those I consider my Dharma brothers, my male monastic brothers. Both guidance and support that's been really helpful for me. And I'm so glad to say that that's with all appreciation to those venerable teachers and mentors. I'm so glad that I haven't only had male teachers, that I've had the elder female monastic teachers who have been great mentors and supporters and luminaries for me. For me, that's been really, really important to have them live and in person, as well as reading about them in the ancient texts. So I've spent a lot of time learning about and researching their lives in the ancient texts, to the point that I actually know them better than I do the stories of the leading males in the Buddha's lifetime. And I've spent time with looking at and holding their relics, and looking at them, meditating with them, or sharing their stories out, or rediscovering their stupas, their ancient stupas, and things like this. And I love to do that. Maybe I have a kind of a tendency, I've heard is a popular thing in some branches of Tibetan Buddhism. It's to to rediscover the ancient buried treasure teachings and bring them forth into the world again at the right time. So I have some kind of tendency like that, like a love for doing that kind of thing. Really fundamentally, deeply, it's rooted in just loving to get at the gold in the Dhamma. What is clear and pure and true, essential and bright and liberating in the Dhamma, as I talked about the Pavasara Sutta, the teaching on the mind, the heart being essentially bright light, of the essence of clear light. So I sense the need for this in others, as well as in myself. And thinking and knowing in compassion that there are things that have been supportive for me that may be supportive for others too, then I feel happy to share those things out and let them be out there with the hope, with the wish that for he or she who would benefit from them, for whom it would be a support, as it's been for me, that it would be, one of the stones on their path, like that. Yeah, there's the Buddha himself in the past life stories is said to have told a story when he met a previous Buddha, the lamplighter, Dipankara, ancient Buddha. And his response on seeing that Buddha and the Sangha coming was to lay down over muddy or rocky patch of the road. Even there was a ascetic with long hair. He spread out the long hair, lay that down, please walk over this. Yeah. So my mind might not be, quite exactly like that, but I have the thought, if I can put down a stone here and a stone there for the path for others, that can be a support for them to walk on, or like the sheaves of grass that become the awakening seat, or that kind of thing, to add a little bundle of grass to that awakening seat for me and for others. Yeah. So with my efforts, I can cut some grass and put some on my own seat, and also give some to you. That's my thought about it. Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that. I have deep gratitude. There's the way for all of those teachers, that the Dhamma that they've taught, and I'd say in a way, kind of like the essence of their being in Dhamma. Really, it makes absolutely no difference whether they're male or female. And this is a common teaching. And yet, there's the way that it does make a difference. And I recognize in these teachings of the Buddha, and they're being passed down, that's for when it does make a difference, for who it does make a difference, so that there wouldn't be any obstacle or obstruction set up by Buddhism itself because of this, but rather that it be a support in so many ways according to the needs that we have as human beings in the different stages of the path. So if we give a teaching that's far beyond and then you're here. And how are you going to cross? How are you going to do that? Will you be able to leap without a bridge or without a path being there? But the Buddha taught about his teaching as being a path, and really an integrated step-by-step path that's so supportive in so many different ways. And this is an important aspect of it. I wanted to highlight it for International Women's Day and for National Women's History Month, because it's a place where we can and do get into trouble sometimes. It's a place where there can be misunderstandings, not clear view, not clear seeing and understanding. But my understanding is that enabling that clear view and understanding and trying to share that as much as possible is basically what this vehicles or path that we call Buddhism is here for. It's what it's for, fundamentally. So all kind of cultural and traditional and various kinds of things like that included, but aside, not to be an obstacle, not to be a hindrance. So I'd like to end today here with that, unless anyone else has any super urgent question. And thank you for your joining in this Dhamma reflection together. I want to especially thank all of those who have offered this space and who have offered the food here and who have offered the robes that warm this body on this chilly day, and even the electric, and then on the end of Sikyu, Scholastic Institute Chogi Gyaltsen, for all of the supporters who, with their heart of generosity and loving kindness, have shared this opportunity together.
Sadhu, 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 anumodami.
And I'd like to share the merit and blessings with all of our teachers, all those who have been luminaries in our lives, all those who are our Dhamma friends and supporters, all the vast number of many living beings that we don't know, extending out into the vastness of the cosmos and beyond, and especially with deep compassion, care, and loving kindness for anyone with whom there may have ever been any difficulty in this life or any life. May the water of the blessings and merit of the goodness of our contemplating the Dhamma and our practice be dedicated to the healing, to bringing to peace and freedom and release of any such thorns or hindrances in our heart. Coming to release, we may know that freedom that was the hallmark of the Buddha's awakening, all the great members of the Sangha and of this path for ourselves in our own hearts, in our own bodies and minds.
Thank you very much for wonderful teachings, also from the side of Sikyu. And thank you to the whole Dhammantarini Vihara, which also enabled it. So I hope to see you soon next week, and we'll stay in touch.
And more to this. Thank you.